The first thing we're going to do, we have unknown number 7, and you'll be given physical data in terms of how to calculate your density, so on and so forth. So the first thing I want to do is to just kind of show you what the liquid is. I poured some of the liquid into a separate container, test tube. One of the things we probably don't want to do is keep going back to that original container and taking stuff out for each test, just in case I contaminated the tip of the pipette. So this is our pure unknown number 7, and what I'd like for you to do is just to write down what you see in terms of what physical state it is, what color it is. If it's colorless, state that, so on and so forth. So here's our unknown. I'm going to pour some water, distilled water, into the first test tube. And then I want to add several drops because I want to make sure if it is soluble or not. I want to be able to see that meniscus. And then always give a good stir. And as you can tell, I don't really see any layers. And since it is soluble in water, remember from our flow chart, what I want to do is test the pH of that solution. So I'm going to take a drop and put on my pH strip here. And as you can see, it's looking more like around pH of 6. So I'm just going to put that back to you. If that is pH 6 and it was soluble in water, if you go back to the solubility chart, what does that tell you? What type of compound is it? pH of 6 is neutral, so now I'm looking at a neutral substance that is soluble in water. What can you infer about that compound? If it's neutral, think about what functional group it would have. Possible functional groups. The first test that we're going to do is the ceric nitrate test, and what I did was just to put some of that in the test tube so you can see the color of that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of water, put into a clean test tube, and then I'm going to add a couple drops of my unknown and mix that up. And then what I want to do is to take a drop or two, probably take a good meal maybe, we'll see what happens, and put that in there and see what. And if you notice, it went from yellow to this red color, so that's a positive test. And what does the ceric nitrate reagent identify? It's positive because there was a color change. So make sure you make note of that. So since we have a red color, that means, and remember the ceric nitrate test is positive for alcohols. So now what we're looking at is an alcohol functional group. So what we're going to do now is, well, what other tests can we use to determine what class of alcohols is it? Is it primary, secondary, tertiary? So the next test I'm going to move into would be chromic acid. Remember, once you start, each test will narrow it down perhaps to another functional group or isolate it to a more limited number of functional groups that's possible. Because at the beginning, when we said this was soluble in water and the pH was around neutral, 6.5 to 8, in that range, then that could have been a low molecular weight alcohol, it could have been a lower molecular weight aldehyde, ketone. So that's where we have to kind of focus in. Okay, well, what test can we do that will either eliminate or be proof that we have a functional group? The ceric nitrate test, since it is low molecular weight, is positive, so I'm thinking it is a low molecular weight alcohol. But I need to be specific. I can't just say it's an alcohol. What class do I have? So the next thing we're going to do is do the chromic acid test. And what I'm doing, I like to have a control so that you can see whether it's positive or negative, if there was any change. So all I've done is to add acetone, that's the solvent for this next test. And then for the chromic acid, I'm going to add drop or two into that first test tube, and this is our standard or our blank reference compound. Nothing's happened to it. So now what I want to do is to go back. Here's my acetone. I'm going to add a few drops of the acetone to, a few drops of my sample into the acetone. Make sure everything's mixed. And then I'm going to take a drop or two of the chromic acid reagent. And if you notice, the orange color disappeared and we have that kind of bluish green precipitate. One thing about the chromic acid test, you should not really go back and look at any results for the chromic acid after 15 minutes. So if something hasn't changed within 15 minutes, don't go back and look at it. But that would be positive. So what does that tell us? If that's positive for chromic acid, then we know we had an alcohol. Well, what type of alcohol could that be? Well, if it reacted with the chromic acid, it could either be primary or secondary. So how do I distinguish between primary and secondary? That's going to give rise to the next test that we do, which is the Lupus test. Someone made a couple mils of the Lupus reagent to a test tube, and then to that I'm going to add a few drops of my unknown. And as you can tell, there's no turbidity. Remember, the Lupus reagent, the Lupus test, can help distinguish between primary, secondary, tertiary alcohols. If it is a tertiary alcohol, we should have seen turbidity instantaneously, cloudiness. There's no cloudiness within that. So what we can do, if this doesn't react within 5 minutes, then we know that it's not a secondary alcohol. If it takes longer than 5 minutes, then typically it's going to be a primary alcohol. Now you can put this in a warm water bath to see if anything happens, and I can do that. And so I have also seen it may take anywhere after 5 up to 15 minutes. So we'll leave that in a hot water bath for a while, and then we'll come back and check it. And then if it's still clear, then that's going to tell us it is a primary alcohol. So I'm going to put this in a water bath and we'll come back and check it later. Right, it's been 15 minutes in a warm water bath. There's still no turbidity. So we're going to call that or deduce that that would be a primary alcohol.